Thank you all so much for coming. We were just remarking about half an hour ago, is anyone going to come? Because it's like the first sort of vaguely sunny, warm day we've had in ages. So thank you for coming. I am here to talk about world building, as Michelle has explained. First of all, and there's another interactive part to the talk as well. The 5 sort of top-level section headers for this talk all use a song or album title from the same band, and if anyone can tell me at the end of the talk which band it is, you get extra points. Extra points for what? I'm not sure, but sometimes it helps to have a thing to help you structure things. So I'm going to start off by sort of introducing myself a bit more. So I am what I am not, and what I am not is I am not a futurist. Now, in some ways, sometimes when you introduce yourself to people, particularly in like networking contexts, which are like awful, but we have to do them anyway, you need that one word that gets people into the ballpark of what you do. And sometimes I'm obliged to use the word futurist then, but I really don't like it because it puts me in, people are like, oh, like Elon Musk. No, really not like that guy at all. Like Ray Kurzweil that whole sort of flying cars, where's my jetpack, holidays on the moon thing. That's not what I do. Because the future is dead. But notice, please, first of all, the scare quotes are very important. And also the capital T and the capital F, right? The capital T, capital F future is dead. And that's actually a good thing. It's a good thing. Because the future is... So I was raised with the future, right? As a science fiction reader in the late 20th century. I grew up on the future. And the future was old then, actually, in like the 80s, late 80s when I started reading stuff like that. The future was already old. And it's even older now. It's dead and it's tired, and that's one of the reasons everything feels so kind of scary when we try and think forward in time. Everything feels scary because all the promises we kind of grew up with in the past have all kind of proven themselves not to be very likely, and also tend to be associated with people who aren't great. So it's a good thing that future is dead. It really is a good thing. We should celebrate the death of the future, because if we accept that the future is dead, we can think about what we want to build instead of the future. And here is the same point made by one of the greatest living science fiction writers on the face of the planet, M. John Harrison. Read his stuff. He's brilliant. So instead of the future, I like to talk about futurity, which is, at the risk of sounding overly technical, the temporal field of the possibility of change, right? To put it another way, instead of the future, many possible futures. Futures plural. Okay? So, I'm not a futurist, but I am a critical futurist, and I was kind of explaining to Michelle a bit earlier. That kind of means, a big part of my job is looking at other people's ideas of the future and saying, nah, mate. That's not going to work, is it? And, as I said to Michelle, it's like I've kind of operationalized being that guy. I've turned being that guy into a career, which for someone my age is a kind of good, it's a good get out. I hope it is anyway. I'm trying to make a useful thing out of my most fundamental character flaws, I guess. It seems to be working. I'm here and people are smiling at me, so it must be going all right. But the exits are there if you see me run. We know what's happening. So I am a critical futurist, and I am also a world builder. So I got into all this mess because I wanted to be a science fiction writer, and I did all the practice and training for that, but it turns out that actually making a living selling science fiction as science fiction is not an easy thing in the 21st century because the books business is a mess. But it turns out you can do much the same sort of work with a different label, and you get to do things like this, which is pretty good. So I'm a world builder, and what does that actually mean though? Well, it means I make stuff like this, and we will get to the sort of stuff I make later on, talking through the sort of stuff I make in collaboration with lots of other people, to be clear. I do not make this stuff on my own. Some of it I make on my own, but most of it is made in collaboration with other people. We will discuss and explore those things and some of the processes of making them as we go through. All right. So, in order to get us through this talk, if I can get you to swallow this first thing, we'll be fine. Okay, and I don't think it's a big ask, but it's worth sort of setting it up at the start and saying you're going to need to kind of take this thing and go with it for the rest of it to make sense. Okay, and that is, as Michelle has already suggested, right, all our notions of futurity, all our discussions of futures, they're all narratives, they're all stories. All futures are stories. I'm not seeing anyone who looks really freaked out by that, but let's go with it. So yeah, this is an idea I've been kicking around for a long time, and there's so it sounds like kind of theory for the sake of theory, but it really isn't. There's an important aspect here. So in this paper I wrote nearly 10 years ago now, I wanted to make this point that futures are lots of things. Futures, the narratives of futurity, right? Narratives of futurity. And that means you can take things like a science fiction novel, and you can take things like a plan for a neighbourhood in northern Copenhagen. And you can put them in the same box, right? These are both narratives of futurity. Very different sorts of narratives, but they are both stories about futurity. And they also fit into a whole range of other things, a whole range of other categories. Product prototypes are narratives of futurity. Political manifestos are narratives of futurity. Investment portfolio growth forecasts, nation-state budget plans, technology brand ad spots, computerized predictive systems models, New Year's resolutions, right? Every time you make a New Year's resolution, you are making a narrative of futurity. See, you're all futurists. Isn't that great? Just like Elon Musk. So, no one looks too, this could be dangerous, but show of hands, does anyone not accept that futures are narratives? Okay, we should be good. So, and here are some examples, right? And another way of explaining the point is that any story we tell that has a timeline that goes past the day it's being told is a narrative of futurity, right? So number go up is like the classic narrative of futurity, right? Capitalism is pure narrative of futurity, always has been. Number go up, number go up, number must go up. So marker when I first made this slide, so the Conservative Party, the British Conservative Party's manifesto from I think 2015, that was a narrative of futurity. It's worked out interestingly for all of us. And the sort of classic 1960s, soon we will all live in a donut in space sort of stuff. Narrative of futurity. So narratives of futurity. But these things exist in all sorts of other spaces, and as I already mentioned, right, when we talk about the future of urban spaces, or just the future of spaces in general, right, the future of spaces in which we spend time, in which we have a stake, right? So that's a narrative of futurity. That's a narrative of urban futurity right there. I'm not sure it's one I want to live in. Can't be honest with you, but that's a narrative. Someone is telling a story about what they think the future should or could be. Okay, that's a narrative of futurity as well. I think I'd prefer to live in that one, but it's probably just as sketchy in other ways. And that is a narrative of futurity. I think it's easy to tell which one we really don't want to live in here, but it's very important to note dystopia is just as much a part of the game as utopia. All right, let's get that off the screen because that's heavy. All right, so you swallowed the basic concept. Now, we've got a chance to discuss this stuff towards the end. Okay, so I do have to do a little bit of theory stuff here, but I'm going to treat it very lightly because you're not literature students. You don't need to. The point of me introducing this is not that you will take away a narrative of narratological theory model. It is to point out that this model gets us to where we want to go. Okay, so don't sweat it the next 5 slides. It's cool. I'm just kind of waving words at you. We can dig into it a bit more later. You can read stuff I've written about it if you're curious. But I kind of have to go through this in order to get us to where we need to go. But it's all right, you've already done the hard bit. You've accepted the futures are stories. It's fine, just go with it. Go with it. So this is a lady called Mieke Bal, Dutch lady, Dutch narratologist. And I have based a lot of my work on elements of her theory of narrative. And this is how I will explain what it is to be a world builder. So Michel's model works like this. There are three major elements. You've got the reader here, you've got the author there, you've got agents in the middle, focalizer in there, narrator, narratee. But the really, really important bit are these three boxes, right? It's the three boxes we're going to follow through, and we're going to go into the model first and then back out. Don't sweat it, it's cool. So, first into the model, then back out again. So, into the model, first thing we encounter as the reader, because we all start as readers, first thing we encounter is the outer box here, and the outer box is the text. And the text is the words on the page that the reader encounters, as put there by the author. Now, the point to make here is that this narratological model is designed for books. Now, books are a very simple medium. It's part of the magic of them. It's exactly because they're simple that you can do so much with them. Cinema is a much more complicated medium, but in some ways much more restricted. Point being, we could do the same model for cinema, but we would literally be here all afternoon, right? We're sticking with books because it's simple, and also because I'm a writer, because I understand this better. So the text is the words on the page that the reader encounters, and that might be like the physical paper page, that might be the ebook reader page, doesn't really matter. The point is, words on the page, that's the text. So the next element we encounter is the story, sometimes also referred to as the plot. And the story or plot is a set of events and or utterances, so things that people say, things that people or other things may say sometimes, that the text describes for the reader. But note, so those events happen in, they have a chronological sequence, but you don't necessarily encounter them in a chronological sequence. Okay, sometimes we read a story and we get the middle first and then we go to the end through the beginning. Writers, what can you do? Third element, the fabula, sometimes also known as the story world, is a four-dimensional imaginary space in which the events and utterances of the story take place. So, four-dimensional space, I mean, it depends on the audience I get. I'm going to, I don't want to embarrass anyone. I'm going to unpack the idea of four-dimensional space in case anyone's a bit sort of like, whoa, that sounds a bit Star Trek. Okay, and I'm going to use a very un-Star Trek metaphor to explain four-dimensional space. Right, so this is a fish tank. A fish tank is a three-dimensional object. We all get that, right? Length, breadth, height. Height? That's not a real word. Three-dimensional space, right? And if you look at a picture of a fish tank like that, it's very much a three-dimensional object. But if you're watching a fish tank in real life and the fish are moving around inside, they are moving in the fourth dimension of time. Right? So a fish tank with stuff moving inside it is a four-dimensional space. And a story is like a fish tank. There you go, you see? It's easy, this stuff, isn't it? So now we move back out of the model from the centre. And we learn a few things on the way. First of all, the fabula is not exhausted by the story, or in less theoretical language. There is always more story world than a story shows the reader. And interestingly, the more story you try and write in a story world, the more the story world grows. You literally cannot exhaust the fabula by writing more in it. You just make it bigger. Okay, more simply still, one story world, many possible stories. Okay, think of, sorry to have to do this to you, but think of the Marvel movies, right? They just keep coming up with more, don't they? There's a lot of story world in there. There's a lot of story in that story world. Possibly too much. Another way of thinking about this, and this is a metaphor from a guy who never wrote science fiction at all and would probably have been quite discomforted by most of it. Ernest Hemingway. And the point he made here is kind of quite germane, right? You think about, if you're on a boat and you see an iceberg kind of cruising past you, and it has this sort of slow dignity. And Hemingway's point was the reason that iceberg has a slow dignity as it moves past you is because there's a huge part of it you don't see. Hemingway's argument being, in Hemingway's head, and the head of anyone who tells stories, is all this massive iceberg that you never get to see. But the story that you are shown, the bit at the top, hopefully, if we've done our job right, moves in that graceful way precisely because We know all that's there. One more step out of the model. The story is not exhausted by the text. So you may not all have read The Lord of the Rings, and you may not all have seen it, but I bet you all know what The Lord of the Rings is. I'm not seeing any head shaking here. That's lucky. So we often joke in the world of writing, it's sort of, it's one of the classic learning to write advice pieces you get when you start learning to write. Is don't write about your characters eating breakfast. It doesn't move the story along, right? It's what I had for breakfast is not relevant to unless you're my dietitian, doesn't matter. Lord of the Rings is unusual in that you see characters eating breakfast in it quite often. There's a reason for that. Most of the characters in Lord of the Rings are hobbits, and eating is a big deal for hobbits. The point I'm trying to make here, though, is that even when it's relevant to show the breakfast, you don't want to show every breakfast. Think how long Lord of the Rings would be if you saw every breakfast those characters ate. Big book, right? And because you want to get to the bit where he's throwing the ring in the mountain. So like skipping over as many breakfasts as possible, and not just breakfast, right? Bathroom breaks, arguments over who gets to do the washing up. It's not story relevant unless you're doing bourgeois literature, in which case I can't help you. So, and this happens in the stories we tell as well, right? Tell people how you met your partner. You don't tell them everything that happened that day. You tell them the good bits. And the more you tell that story, the better an idea you have of what the good bits are. So there is, there you go. You're not only are you futurists, you're now narratologists as well. Okay, this has been a highly efficient lecture. I bet you're glad you came. Now, if we think about the story not being exhausted by the text, this is a book, I can't say it in Russian, which is probably fortunate for everyone involved. But in translation, the title of this book is The Last Ring Bearer. It's by a gentleman called Kirill Eskov. And basically what Eskov has done here is he has retold The Lord of the Rings, but from the point of view of the orcs. Okay? Now, so in terms of this narratological model, the fabula and the story are basically stolen. Stolen is a big word, but he's basically taken the story world and the story are Tolkien's story world and story, but he's written a text that comes at them both from a different direction. Okay, so that story was not exhausted by Tolkien's texts. Multiple texts are possible with each story. The question of the politics of the last ring bearer are complex, and we don't want to go into that today. But the point being, so the reason I've showed you all this is first of all to understand that for those of us who encounter media, which is all of us, all the time, you're encountering media now, kind of. When you're watching TV, when you're scrolling through TikTok, whatever you're doing, you're encountering media. And any given media mediates between you and an author or a creator or a director or whatever it is. In the case of books, it's a fairly simple model. In the case of other media, it's fairly complicated. But the point is there is a mediation there, and media is where narrative happens. In fact, that's what media is. It's channels for narrative. And while the model would be slightly different, any story that someone is telling you, any narrative that you are encountering, will somewhere within it have a fabula, a story world. There's always a world in there. If you go into any story, there is always a world. Maybe very, very similar to the one you already know, even if only by implication. Might be really, really weird. Either which way, there's always a story world in the middle. So, now I need to tell you about design fiction. And you're thinking, what is that? What is design fiction, Paul? What the hell is design fiction? Has anyone, show of hands, has anyone heard of design fiction before? Okay, we got a few. Okay, cool. All right, well, for the rest of you, what the hell is design fiction? So, Design fiction comes out of, and this is sometimes contested by people who are involved in it, but it's basically rooted in the practice and teaching and scholarship of Anthony Dunn and Fiona Raby, who spent a long time at the Royal College of Art in London, in the UK. And they were very interested in the use of design for something other than just, a lot of design is about, making a product and thinking, well, is this a sellable product? So there's a kind of speculation 20 piece of design. But what Dunn and Raby wanted to do was say, okay, well, can we use design to think about not whether, is this a product that will sell, but sort of, can we use those techniques to explore the possibilities of stuff? And also, can we use it to kind of critique stuff? What if design, but critical? Crazy idea, might just work. So this is a quote from a talk that my friend and colleague Anab Jain gave back in 2013. And in terms of what design fictions do, this is a pretty good summary, I think. So they bypass established narratives about the present and future that create the hypnosis of normality. I think that really speaks to what Michelle was talking about earlier, right? And what I was talking about with the death of the future, that hypnosis of normality, right? Have you heard the phrase, Tina, there is no alternative? That's the hypnosis of normality. Neoliberal capitalism. Shh. If you say that 3 times, it appears. It's very messy. So, bypass the hypnosis of normality and allow for an emotional connection with the raw weirdness of our times, opening up an array of possibilities. So that's what it does. But you're thinking, okay, what is it, Paul? What is it? So, Minority Report, not a great movie in my opinion. But so everyone knows about the gestural interfaces in Minority Report. Did anyone see that? So this was kind of before, really. This was a bit before smartphones and a bit before iPads and stuff like that. A bit before gestural interfaces were actually a thing. But you make a movie set in the future and you know that gestural interfaces are going to be a thing. So you get some designers in, you're sort of like, I know we don't have gestural interfaces, but if we did, what would they look like? The designer goes, oh. It's like, all right, make that happen on screen. Right? So you communicate a sense of futurity in your movie. But you also, if you're a designer, you get to kind of put your idea of what something that you know is going to be a product in front of people. It's kind of almost a prolepsis. It's not a prediction, it's more a way of saying, what if it looked like this? What if you hired me to make it look like this? So I mean, you've probably heard people sort of, Star Trek predicted the iPad. No, it didn't. The people who made the iPad looked to Star Trek and they were like, oh, that's a good idea. Cause and effect. So that's kind of design fiction. I mean, that is design fiction. You can chop the difference. But design fiction, as I'm thinking about it now, and as defined by this man here, Bruce Sterling, science fiction writer, design critic. And he said that design fictions are fakes of a theatrical sort, but they are not wicked frauds or hoaxes intended to rob or fool people. A design fiction is a creative act that puts the viewer into a different conceptual space for a while and then lets him go. Design fiction has an audience, not victims. Right, so another way of saying what Sterling's saying here is that design fictions are objects that are lies, but they're not lies to deceive you, they're lies to make you think. A bit like science fiction, right? None of it's true, but we're trying to make you think. So here are some examples. So Julian Oliver's Transparency Grenade, I think, was a 2011 project. So that's the year of WikiLeaks, hence the sort of vibe of the whole thing. And just to be really clear, right? This is not explodey. Okay, it's an art object. It's something you put in a museum with a little thing explaining it. It looks nice. It makes a visual rhetorical point. Okay, the transparency grenade is a way of thinking about a world in which these issues have come to a real head, and it is the whole point of it is by putting that object in front of people, you imply the world in which it might exist. Okay, so we talked about worlds earlier, and I couldn't do the narrative model for design fiction. I'm not a designer, that's not my job. But this is an object from a world which doesn't exist. Do you see what I mean? It's a kind of science fiction, right? What design fiction people are doing is they're producing props or images from movies that have not been made, from science fiction movies that have not been made, right? They're doing that same thing. They're putting a part of an imagined world in front of you. Drone Aviary by Superflux, again, sort of 2012-ish, you know, when drones were still kind of new and exciting rather than just death machines. And so they sort of explored the idea with Drone Aviary. And so again, so the point here is not that this, you know, it's very unlikely that you'd actually have a traffic control drone. That wasn't the point of the exercise. The point of the exercise was to make you think about the sort of world in which a traffic drone would make sense. You know, subtle hint, it's not really about the drones, is it? Right? It's not really about the drones. Tobias Ravel's New Mumbai, so you don't even need to make a thing, you can just make an image and tell a story with an image. And here people have discovered that these mushrooms can produce electricity, so people start growing them on the balconies of slums where there's no sort of regular supply of electricity. If you know the William Gibson phrase, the street finds its own use for things. Science fiction, in an image, just bang. And mitigation of shock, Superflux again. So this is kind of, so what if you go from the single object and you go in the same direction that art has gone? You say, okay, well, we go from the single object to the installation. And what Superflux did here is they got themselves access to a big, an apartment in London, and they just made it out inside as if, you know, so that the hypothesis here is outside the ecosystem has collapsed, you've got to grow all your own food in the house. And they actually, so design fictions don't always work. Often they just kind of have the appearance, they're prototypes, you know, they don't really do anything, but they just look like they should do something. But in this case, the hydroponic systems they built are actually, you know, they're food computers. They actually kind of automatically nurture the plants in there. Right, so yeah, so literally you step into this apartment, you step inside a future, and you can kind of walk around inside it. And there's a lot of detail. There's, you know, there's documents and newspapers and stuff that tell you more about the world. It's an entire thing you can explore. And that's the point, right? There's a fictional world that you can literally step inside. And this is a project called Vitiden from KTH up in Stockholm. I'm running low on time, so just go and look it up. But again, you know, you take a big Swedish energy agency, does a big scenario about what the future might look like if we reduce our carbon footprint. Doesn't really describe what reducing our carbon footprint would actually look like at all. So these researchers are like, okay, what might that look like? Lovely project. So, is that stuff world building? I'd say it is. Some design fiction people don't like it when I say that. Some of them don't mind. I think that is world building. I think science fiction writing is world building. I think political manifesto writing is world building. I think green urban planning is world building. But what about the world building I do? You know, I promised you some show and tell. So, 3 case studies. First of all, the Rough Planet Guide to Notre Dame 2045. So, it's a travel guide. Yeah, and we actually printed this. It's a little booklet about so large. All the copies are gone. I'm sorry, we didn't print enough. And you know, it's, yeah, and as the name suggests, right? It resembles a European city you might know. No clues, no clues. But it's this city in 2045, right? And this was part of a project about the decarbonisation of hard-to-reach supply chains. And our job in the work package we had on this project was to make that interesting for an audience who weren't engineers and supply chain specialists. So we thought, well, how do you make, if you want to take someone, if you want someone to visit the future, give them a guidebook, right? That's what guidebooks are for. And so you can explore what there is to eat in Notre Dame. You know, everything from you know, sort of fermented soy-based stuff to invertebrate mystery meats, but also, like, you know, basically dumpster diving as a restaurant business model. We already have that in Malmo, to be quite honest. Pretty good. But also, how do you get there? And once you're there, how do you get around? All the things you'd want to know about this city. And the point is, that's the magic of a travel guide, is you can do something that science fiction really can't do most of the time, which is just tell people stuff. Right? Most of the time as science fiction, you are supposed to deliver some story first. But with a travel guide, people are just, you read a travel guide because you want it to tell you stuff. That's the whole point. So it's a great means for exploring futures like this. Put a travel guide in people's hands, they're like, oh, right, cool. Second case study, Lund University Magazine 2041, Jubilee issue. It's a long story how we got to do this. I still don't entirely believe it myself, but we somehow did it. And so Lund University, maybe Copenhagen University does the same thing. So it actually prints like a physical magazine 4 times a year, prints about 20,000 copies and just leaves them all over the campus. As a British person, that is still blows my mind that they do that. Absolutely nuts. And we got them to let us do a Jubilee issue as if it was 2041, the 375th anniversary of its founding. And so, but how did we do this? So this was during COVID times. And, we wanted to get a whole bunch of, we didn't want to just kind of sit and imagine it as researchers. We wanted to get ideas from people all around the university about how the university might change. So we had stakeholders, everyone from deans down to students, really sort of wide array of people. But of course we had to do everything through Zoom and Miro, which was quite challenging. This was 2021, when using Zoom and Miro for everything was still quite new and still quite challenging. But we somehow managed to pull it off, mostly thanks to a good friend of mine, Chef Van Galen, Dutch guy, very, very good at this sort of thing. And the process we went through is we said to these people, okay, first of all, it's a bit like D&D, we're going to make a character for you to role play. I mean, literally, that's, it's a good place to start. So we gave people a randomly generated face, and we said, right, pick a card, your character's current research interest is this, and the thing that keeps them up at night is this, the same again. Bunch of kind of randomly drawn questions. You get a character, and then you start thinking about them. And, people sort of, what sort of, people build out these characters, and you say to them, okay, right, take that character, and we're going to put that in various scenarios. We're going to tell some stories with those characters. And we told a load of stories with them. And these are genuine screenshots from the Miro board, and God bless the people who took the notes, because it was quite mad. Because I was trying to facilitate the entire thing, and I still can't. PTSD. It's crazy stuff. But loads, and we got loads, and it was great. It was really, it was really magical. We got all this amazing stuff. People really got into it. And so we took all this stuff and we sort of condensed it back down again, and we told a bunch of stories with it, and we put those in the magazine, and they look a bit like this. So there's a story about an academic activist. There's this very cool dude here who wants to tell you about all the cool things that students can do, because that's what cool dudes in baseball caps are there for. But you've got this other chap here who is a climate change historian who has written a play which has just been accepted for publication in an academic journal. So these are crazy times. Then again, it is environmental humanities, and they will publish some fairly crazy stuff. I can see Laura nodding there, because so we made a university magazine, but set in 2041. Last case study, which I've numbered incorrectly, shame on me, but it should be 3.3. The Museum of Carbon Ruins. So this one's a bit different in that it's kind of a design fiction in that it's an object or a set of objects, right? It's a set of bits from a museum, vitrines and shelves and drawers and so on and so forth, all of which hold exhibits. And we'd put it in various spaces at first at the political science department in Lund, but then took it on tour. We made a mobile version with a case. Well, what's happening here is, so it turned out you can just put those objects in front of people, but you kind of have to guide them through it. And it's like if you have a design fiction, you need a little sort of card next to it explaining it. If you have this kind of complicated museum setup where the whole conceit, if you like, is okay, this is the museum from 2041, it helps if you can kind of get people into that headspace. And when we first started doing this, there was literally just a little script. Just, welcome to Museum of Carbon Ruins, it's 2041, blah, blah, blah. But interestingly, the more we did it, well, I'll get to this bit in a bit, what was in the museum. So the whole conceit is it's 2041, it's the end of the Carbon Age, and this museum is looking back on our time now, right? So our time now is the past of this museum. This museum is, you know, we are the history that's in here. And the whole point is to say, well, look at all these things that people had back in the 20-teens and the 2020s, right? You know, they used to play football on grass made out of plastic, right? Just like, you know, condensed fossil fuels as football pitches. What were they on, right? They used to give toys to their kids made of that stuff. Their kids are playing with condensed oil, right? Madness. And over there, they used to fly so often back in those days that they'd give you a card so that the more you flew, the cheaper it was for you to fly. Right? So this is almost like design fiction in reverse. What design fiction does is it puts an object in front of you that is not real, and the object decontextualizes you. In science fictional theory, we would say it is an estranging object, right? It performs an act of estrangement. It literally makes things strange. What we did with the Museum of Carbon Ruins is the opposite way around. We took everyday objects and we changed the frame, and we estranged the object and your experience of it that way. So, similar devices, just kind of flipped around. And again, you know, I hadn't sat down and made the narrative model for the Museum of Carbon Ruins because I don't have the time. But you could do one, and there's a world in there, and again, you get to step inside it. And also, you get to be guided around it. And this became quite a thing, right? So initially, there was just this kind of basic script that people would run through. Museum of Carbon Ruins 2041. But after a while, it turned, you know, some visitors are a bit more resistant. You know, some people aren't willing to play the game quite so easily. Some people are, I'm not going to pretend it's 2041. So you have to try a bit harder. And it becomes a theatrical thing. It becomes a performance. And it becomes quite fun, actually, because all of a sudden you're not just a researcher reading a script. You actually become one of the staff of this museum. You are performing that role. And after a while, we were like, oh, we could do something with this. Because it's like the problem with a project like this, brilliant fun, really exciting to people, almost impossible to document. It's like, because people are like, great, well, you know, you should do a paper at conferences about that. And we're like, oh Christ, how do you even start? So we decided, why do a paper when we could just go and do the museum at the conferences instead? So we pitched conferences and we said, right, give us a panel, and we'll do a thing with it. And we would just set up in a room and we would do the museum, and people would come in and we'd sort of say, you know, and we'd take them on a trip through time. We'd sit them down in the museum and ask them, here are our objects. What do you think we should add? You know, is there anything we should add? What do you think of this? You know, it's a Swedish museum, perhaps in the country that we're in now. Would you have different things in your museum? And you know, people get into it again. You know, it's a time travel game. And so we did it at conferences. The last one I did, we did it on a boat parked outside the Norwegian museum, the Norwegian National Museum of Oil. A very, very weird gig. A lot of fun, but really weird. A colleague of ours, Graham MacDonald, God bless him, whose interest in Brechtian theatre may have influenced what we were doing quite a bit. He actually got to do a Carbon Ruins performance at COP26 in Glasgow a couple of years ago. So, I'm running low on time, so I want to be fairly brief about this bit. So there's a lot of reasons why I do this work, and I think some of that is probably obvious, and I think we'll dig into some of it as well in our discussion to come. But a really, really important part of why I do this and why we do this is because, you know, so it's about hope, and Laura's going to like this because I think we're on the same page. Though we're using different words sometimes. This is hopeful work, right? And I want to be really, really clear that hope is not the same thing as optimism. It's not the same thing at all. And to explain that, rather than me mangle the explanation, I'm going to refer to Rebecca Solnit, who is a better writer than I will ever be in my entire life. And Rebecca Solnit says, "An optimist is someone who thinks things will be all right no matter what. It is the flip side of being a pessimist, which means thinking everything will be bad no matter what." So, like Rebecca Solnit, I am not an optimist. Instead, I have hope. In fact, instead I do hope. Because as Rebecca Solnit says, what I am is hopeful because being hopeful means there are possibilities, but it is up to us to seize them and make something of them. Okay? Optimism is passive, right? It'll be fine. Someone else will sort that out. It's cool. I don't need to worry. Being hopeful is sort of like, well, things could be better. But, you know, someone's going to have to pick up a shovel and start digging, aren't they? You know, optimism doesn't get you out of bed in the morning. It doesn't get me out of bed in the morning, at least. Not a lot does, to be quite honest, these days. But when I do get out of bed, it's for hope. And there's a reason why I finished my case studies with the Museum of Carbon Ruins, because I think that particularly illustrates that sense of hope as an active principle, as something you don't just have, but something you do. And in what is kind of a shameful faux pas, but it's all right because I'm not an academic anymore, so I can do this, but I'm going to quote my own work, which is really sort of cringe. I wrote a thing a while ago that was published, I finished it nearly 2 years ago, and it was published about a month ago, academic publishing, magical stuff, writing about the Museum of Carbon Ruins, MCR. And I made the point, and this is based on not just my own experience, but that of my colleagues. The Museum of Carbon Ruins involves not only the imagining of new roles, but the literal acting out of those roles, changing them while also being changed by them, escaping the straitjacket of the researcher as expert. Yeah. It's an academic chapter, so I go on in that vein for quite a while, because you've got to use up the word count. But I believe we all felt it as such, the thrill of breaking a norm which had never been explicitly codified, of describing our intentions and having colleagues ask us, can you actually do that? And seeing our own excitements and anxieties reflected in their faces as they asked us. Perhaps this is simply vanity speaking, but I believe us to have been, and to have been becoming, utopia in those moments. Utopia can be something you make, like an imagined museum in a decarbonised future, but it can also be something you do, something you are. You know, utopia is not a product, it's a process. So I want to end with an anecdote, actually. So not long after we'd finished a project at Lund, probably a couple of years ago now, we'd interviewed a bunch of climate activists from Kalmar on the east coast of Sweden, and they said, "Oh, this has been really interesting. Can you come and do a workshop with us?" And my colleague Eleanor and I at the time, we were like, yeah, sure, great, fantastic. I mean, yeah, we thought we might get some more data out of it. It was nice to give these people a bit more of our time. You know, we saw it as a way of taking the work out into the world. And I'll be honest with you, it was not the best workshop in the world. And I accept a lot of the responsibility for that. The circumstances didn't help, but it turns out that running a workshop with people whose grasp of English as a second language is not great is really hard when you only speak English. Yeah, and that's the fault there lies with me, not with them. But also, mixed up expectations, a problematic venue, weather, travel difficulty. Also, many things conspired for it not to be a great workshop at all. And in the end, basically what we managed to get them doing is kind of sitting around with big bits of, flip chart paper, the big A0 flip chart paper, sitting around in groups, and we just said to them, how about you draw a map of what you think what you might like Kalmar to look like in 2050. And this was not, we had hoped for deliverables and outcomes of far superior quality than this. And I was, I felt I'd let these people down as well. And I still think I did on some level. But what was amazing is at the end of the session, we did that awkward thing. It was like, thank you for having us. Is there anything we could have done better? And And they said to us, oh, this has been wonderful. We never realised we could do this. We never realised we could just sit down and think about what we wanted our town to look like in 2050. And I was like, right, I mean, these are climate activists. You know, admittedly of a very wide age range. I think the youngest was like 22 and the oldest was literally 70, bless her. But yeah, and they're not the sort of chaining themselves to stuff climate activists either, right? They're pretty small town, and that's no insult intended at all. But yeah, these are, you know, I was like, these are your climate activists. Surely of all the people out there who might have thought about what the future of their town would look like, surely it's you, but no. And I sometimes talk about, one of the reasons I'm not a futurist is because I think the future desperately needs to be deprofessionalized. The problem with the idea of a futurist is, I mean, we're back to optimism. It's like, oh yeah, the future will be fine. The futurists have got, there's people, yeah, Elon Musk's on it, it'll be fine. There's that sense that the future is not, you know, it's someone else's responsibility. It's like, I couldn't do the future. That's a bit big. And it was really stunning. And you know, I remember thinking at first, it's like, oh wow, you know, I sort of thought, wow, it's brilliant. We've given these people permission to think about the future. And I realised, no, that's you know, shameful white Western male middle class man framing, right? Because it's not for me to give anyone permission to think about their future. What it was for me to do, what it was for us to do, was to remind people that they don't need my fucking permission. They don't need my permission. You don't need my permission. None of us need anyone's permission. We can just do it. We can just do it. So please, go out there and make another world. Thank you. Yeah, I kept a time and everything.
I know.
I know. Holy shit. It doesn't happen often, folks.